When a wealthy businessman is murdered, the killer frames an innocent handyman for the crime, thinking their lies will never be uncovered, but they're dead wrong. His brave young daughter, with the help of determined allies, uncovers the shocking truth and exposes the web of corruption behind the crime. This is a story of courage, determination, and the pursuit of justice against all odds. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're rooting for justice, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The rain fell in relentless sheets, slicking the pavement of Maplewood Park, with a glassy sheen. Shadows from the towering oak tree stretched unnaturally under the dim light of a solitary street lamp. Thunder growled in the distance, muffling the steady tap of polished leather shoes against the soaked ground. Richard Hale stood under the lamp, checking his watch with a scowl. His tailored trench coat did little to shield him from the storm, and the faint glow of his cigar barely illuminated his impatient expression. "This better not be a waste of my time," he muttered to himself, flicking water off his cufflinks. A second figure approached, stepping deliberately into the circle of light. Their face remained obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but the glint of expensive cufflinks and meticulously shined shoes betrayed their status. The figure moved with practiced confidence, carrying a large umbrella that shielded them from the worst of the downpour. "You're late, Hale," barked, his voice echoing in the deserted park. He took a long drag from his cigar, blowing smoke in the figure's direction. "Do you know who I am? Do you think I wait for anyone?" The figure stopped a few feet away, their silhouette towering despite their composed demeanor. "We need to talk," they said, their voice low and controlled. The faint lilt of authority carried over the rain. "Talk about what?" Hale scoffed, his tone thick with mockery. He tossed his cigar to the ground and stomped on it with an exaggerated flourish. "About how you're running out of ways to keep me quiet. I've covered for you long enough, and I want more. The payments aren't cutting it anymore." The figure didn't flinch, though their grip on the umbrella tightened. "You don't want to push me, Hale. This arrangement only works if you keep your mouth shut and stay in line." Hale threw back his head and laughed, the sound bouncing hollowly off the trees. "You push me? You wouldn't dare. You're too careful, too self-important to risk everything over a little disagreement." The figure stepped closer, dropping the umbrella to the ground. Rain cascaded over them, plastering their tailored suit to their frame. "For the first time," Hale faltered, taking a half step back. "Careful," the figure hissed, their voice sharpened. "Now you think I got to where I am by being careful, by tolerating smug little parasites like you?" Hale sneered, though his eyes darted nervously toward the street lamp. "Big talk, but we both know you don't have the guts to follow through, so why don't you hand over what I'm owed and crawl back to whatever hole you came out of?" The tension shattered like glass. The figure lunged, grabbing a wrench hidden under their coat. With a brutal swing, they struck Hale across the temple. The force of the blow sent him sprawling to the wet pavement, his cigar rolling into a nearby puddle. The park fell silent, save for the patter of rain and Hale's faint gurgling breaths. The figures stood over him, their chest heaving as they stared at the crumpled body. Hale twitched once, twice before going still. "I don't make threats," the figure muttered coldly, crouching to wipe the wrench with a handkerchief. "I make promises." Their movements were efficient, practiced. They carefully removed any trace of themselves, wiping down the scene and ensuring no stray fibers or prints remained. With grim precision, they dragged Hale's lifeless body toward a nearby trash can, stuffing him inside as though discarding a broken toy. The figure glanced at their watch, then at the wrench. A malicious smile crossed their lips. They pulled out a small evidence bag from their coats, sliding the wrench inside before heading toward Jack Carter's workshop, conveniently located on the edge of town. The early morning joggers didn't notice the blood at first, mistaking the crimson streaks trailing down the trash can for rust. It wasn't until the unmistakable sight of a pale hand jutting out caught someone's attention. "Oh my God," a woman gasped, pulling out her phone to call the police. Within minutes, the park was cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the damp breeze. Officer Reed Barker, the lead investigator, crouched near the trash can, grimacing as he examined the scene. "Looks like blunt force trauma," he muttered, standing and motioning for the forensics team. One officer approached with evidence in hand. "We found this nearby," he said, holding up a blooded wrench in a clear plastic bag. "Belongs to Jack Carter, name's engraved on the handle." Reed frowned, turning the bag over in his hands. "Jack Carter, the handyman?" "Yep," the officer confirmed, And get this, Carter had an argument with Hale a few weeks ago over unpaid repairs on his property. Witnesses overheard Carter threatening to make him pay. Reed's lips pressed into a thin line. Bring him in now. Jack Carter was jolted awake by the sound of heavy knocking on his door. Groggy and confused, he stumbled to answer it, only to find two officers standing on his porch, their faces grim. Jack Carter, one of them, said, "You're under arrest for the murder of Richard Hale." Jack's jaw dropped. "What murder? I didn't save it." The other officer cut in, pulling out handcuffs. "You've got the right to remain silent, and I suggest you use it." As Jack was led away, a small figure washed from the shadows of the living room. Emily, Jack's 7-year-old daughter, clutched her favorite stuffed bear tightly, tears streaming silently down her face. The air in town was heavy with tension following Jack Carter's arrest. News of the murder spread like wildfire, and the community that once relied on Jack's skills as a handyman now whispered his name in disbelief. The sight of him being led away in handcuffs played repeatedly on the local news. The headline, bold and damning: "Local handyman arrested for Hale murder." Jack sat in a cold gray interrogation room at the police station, his hands cuffed tightly in front of him. His face was pale, but his voice remained steady as he stared at Officer Reed Barker across the table. "You've got it all wrong," Jack said, his voice hoarse from repeating himself. "I didn't kill Richard Hale. That wrench, I haven't seen it in days. Someone must have stolen it." Reed leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Convenient story, Carter, but fingerprints don't lie, and neither does the motive. Witnesses heard you arguing with Hale just weeks ago. That argument was about money he owed me for repairs." Jack shot back. "I didn't threaten him. I told him to pay what he owed. And that was it." Reed's smirk faded, slightly replaced with a hardened expression. "The evidence says otherwise. You're looking at a long sentence, Carter. I suggest you come clean before things get worse." Jack leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. "I didn't do it, and I'll prove it. Someone's setting me up." But Jack's protests fell on deaf ears. Within hours, he was transferred to the county jail, awaiting trial. The wrench with his fingerprints and Hale's blood was more than enough to convince the police and the public that he was guilty. 7-year-old Emily sat on the living room floor, her knees pulled to her chest as she clutched her stuffed bear. The home that once felt warm and safe now felt cold and hollow without her father. She had seen him taken away, his face pale and tired, but he managed to give her a small, reassuring smile before disappearing into the back of the squad car. "Daddy didn't do anything bad," Emily whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She squeezed the bear tighter, her tears soaking its worn fur. "He didn't." The next day at school, Emily's world grew even smaller. Her classmates huddled in groups, whispering and casting glances her way. "That's her." One boy muttered to his friend. "Her dad killed Mr. Hale." Emily overheard and froze, her cheeks burned, and she looked down at her desk, wishing she could disappear. The word stung, but she didn't know how to respond. All she knew was that she wanted to go home, even though home didn't feel the same anymore. Rachel Miller, a longtime friend of Jack and a frequent visitor to their home, stepped in to care for Emily. Rachel was a warm, non-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a quick mind. When she arrived at the Carter home, she found Emily sitting quietly on the couch, staring at the floor. Rachel knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's tear-streaked face. "Emily, sweetheart," she said gently, "your dad didn't do this. I know him. He's a good man, and we're going to prove he's innocent." Emily looked up, her big brown eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "How?" she whispered. "Everyone says he did it, even the police." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Sometimes people jump to conclusions because it's easier than finding the truth. But you and I were going to fight for him. You trust me, don't you?" After a long pause, Emily nodded slowly. "I trust you." Rachel gave her a small smile. "Good. Then let's take it one step at a time." As days turned into weeks, the case against Jack Carter seemed to grow stronger. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man driven to violence by aspiration. They highlighted his financial struggles, claiming that Hale's refusal to pay for repairs pushed Jack over the edge. He had the motive, the opportunity, and the means. The prosecutor declared at a pre-trial hearing Mr. Carter's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, and the tool was traced directly back to his workshop. This was no random act, it was premeditated. Jack's public defender, an overworked and underfunded attorney named Peter Shaw, struggled to keep up with the prosecution's relentless narrative. "Your Honor," Peter argued, "Mr. Carter maintains his innocence, and insists the wrench was stolen. We request more time to investigate this possibility. Judge Kane, a towering man with a commanding presence, sat at the bench, his expression unreadable. His reputation as a non-nonsense judge preceded him, and his decisions carried significant weight in the community. "I'll grant you a short extension," mentioned Mr. Shaw. Kane said, his voice firm. But let me be clear, this case will not drag on unnecessarily. Justice must be served swiftly." Rachel, sitting in the gallery with Emily beside her, clenched her fists. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the judge's demeanor. His words were measured, but there was a coldness in his tone that made her uneasy. Though the days were hard, Emily began to draw strength from Rachel's unwavering determination. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Emily spoke up. "Do you think Daddy's scared?" she asked, her voice small. Rachel reached across the table, placing a hand over Emily's. "Maybe a little," she admitted, "but your dad is strong, and he knows we're out here fighting for him." Emily nodded, a flicker of resolve lighting her eyes. "Then I'll fight too." Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's the spirit, kiddo. We'll figure this out together." Unbeknownst to them, the wheels of corruption were already turning, and the path to the truth would test their courage in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The fight for Jack's innocence was only just beginning. "Who do you think is behind the murder? And why would they go to such lengths to frame Jack?" Share your theories in the comments. And if you're rooting for Rachel and Emily to uncover the truth, don't forget to like this video. The low hum of rain on the roof matched the somber mood in the Carter household. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her small hands clutching a crayon, as she carefully shaded her latest drawing, a picture of her father standing in front of their house. Her eyes remained fixed on the page, her lips pressed tightly together. Rachel Miller leaned against the counter, watching Emily with a heavy heart. The trial was looming, and the evidence against Jack seemed insurmountable. But Rachel knew in her gut that Jack was innocent. Something about the entire situation felt orchestrated, too convenient to be the work of a desperate handyman. After Emily went to bed that night, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a steaming cup of coffee. "All right, Richard Hale," she muttered under her breath, typing his name into a search engine. "Let's see what kind of skeletons you've got in your closet." Within hours, Rachel's instincts were validated. Hale's name was linked to numerous allegations of shady dealings, money laundering, bribes, and even rumors of extortion. The deeper she dug, the murkier his business empire appeared. His connections ranged from real estate tycoons to small-time criminals, but nothing directly linked him to Jack or the wrench that had been used as the murder weapon. Frustrated but undeterred, Rachel picked up the phone. She needed help, someone with the skills and resources to dig deeper. Her mind went to Ethan Blake, a private investigator she had worked with years ago during a local political scandal. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was Ethan. "Rachel Miller," Ethan said with a chuckle when he answered her call. "It's been a while. What's the occasion? Looking to expose another crooked politician?" "Something like that," Rachel replied, tone serious. "I need your help, Ethan. It's about Jack Carter." Ethan's voice softened. "I heard about that tough break. You think he's innocent?" "I know he is," Rachel said firmly. She explained what she'd found about Hale's dealings and her suspicion that Jack was being framed. "But I need more than suspicions. Can you help?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before replying, "I'm in. Send me everything you've got, and I'll start digging." While Ethan continued to investigate Hale's associates, he stumbled across an unexpected lead: discrepancies in Judge Kane's financial records. Ethan found evidence of offshore accounts containing large unexplained deposits. Rachel was stunned when Ethan shared his findings. "Judge Kane, are you sure?" "Pretty sure," Ethan replied. "Halil and Kane had a history. There's evidence Hale paid Kane to make certain cases disappear. If Hale and Kane had a falling out over money or secrets, Kane could have had a motive to get rid of him." Rachel's mind raced. But why frame Jack? Jack was the perfect scapegoat. Ethan said no power, no resources, and just enough circumstantial evidence to make him look guilty. "It's too neat." Rachel clenched her fists. "If Kane's involved, this goes deeper than we thought." Rachel returned home late that evening, her mind buzzing with Ethan's revelation. Emma was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished drawing in front of her. At this time, it wasn't of her father, it was of their family, her Jack and Rachel standing together In front of their house, Rachel sat down across from her. "That's beautiful, Emily." Emily pushed the drawing toward her, her little hands trembling. "Do you think we'll be like this again?" Altogether, Rachel stared at the drawing, her throat tightening. She reached out and took Emily's hand. "I believe we will, and I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure of it." Emily gave a small nod, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I'm going to keep drawing us like this. That way, when Daddy comes home, I can show him." Rachel fought back tears, realizing that Emily's determination was the glue holding them all together. It was a reminder that she couldn't afford to stop now. Not when they were so close to the truth that night. As Rachel reviewed the evidence Ethan had sent her, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Answering cautiously, she was met with a gruff voice. "You need to back off." The voice warned, "You're poking around where you don't belong." Rachel's stomach tightened. "Who is this?" she demanded. The line went dead. Rachel sat in the silence, her heart pounding. She knew that wouldn't deter her, but it confirmed one thing: they were getting closer to the truth. The stakes had never been higher, and Rachel was determined to see justice served, even if it put her in danger. The air in Ethan's dimly lit office was heavy with tension. Rachel sat across from the private investigator, her hands clutching the USB drive, as if her life depended on it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed as he replayed the damning voicemail they had uncovered from Richard Hale's office. "If you ruin me, I'll ruin you first." The voice on the recording was unmistakably judged. His tone was venomous, every word laced with barely restrained fury. Rachel's breath hitched as the recording ended. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and dread. "This proves Kane was involved with Hale, and probably in Jack's framing too." Ethan nodded grimly. "It's enough to blow this case wide open. But you can't go alone with this. Kane's not going to go down without a fight." Rachel looked at the clock. Jack's trial was scheduled to continue in the morning, and this evidence could exonerate him. She slid the USB drive into her purse. "I'll bring it to the court first thing tomorrow." Ethan hesitated, his instincts warning him of danger. "Be careful." Rachel seized, desperate. "He'll do anything to keep this buried." That night, the streets were eerily quiet as Rachel and Emily stepped out of Ethan's office. Rachel walked briskly, her instincts on high alert. Emily clutched Rachel's hand, her grip firm and trembling. "It's too quiet," Emily whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Rachel forced a reassuring smile. "We'll be home soon, just stay close, okay?" Unseen by Emily, Rachel had slipped the USB drive from her bag into her jacket pocket. Before leaving the office, a precaution she hoped wouldn't be necessary. As they neared Rachel's car, two shadowy figures emerged from the darkness. Their steps were deliberate, their intent unmistakable. Rachel froze instinctively, shielding Emily behind her, hand over the bag. "One of the men," demanded, his tone sharp and menacing. Rachel's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to buy time. "Don't play dumb." The second man snapped. "We know." "No, you have it. Give it here, and no one gets hurt." Rachel's grip on Emily tightened. "Run, Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling but urgent. "Go now." Emily hesitated, fear in her eyes. "I don't want to leave you," she cried, her voice breaking. "Go," Rachel shouted, pushing her toward the alley. Emily turned to flee, but was grabbed by one of the men before she could take more than a few steps. "Got her," he muttered, holding her firmly as she kicked and screamed. "Let her go." Rachel charging toward them. The other man intercepted her, striking her hard across the head with the butt of his weapon. Rachel crumpled to the pavement, her vision blurring as blood trickled from her temple. Emily, still struggling, managed to bite the arm of the man holding her, making him yelp and loosen his grip. She broke free and tried to run again, but the first man caught her with a swift blow to the side of her head. She collapsed beside Rachel, unconscious. "Check her jacket," one of the men said, kneeling beside Rachel before they could search her. The distinct crunch of tires on gravel and the beam of headlights interrupted them. A patrol car turned onto the street, its spotlight sweeping the area. "Cops," one of the attackers hissed. "Let's move." In a panic, the men abandoned their search and bolted into the darkness, leaving Rachel and Emily lying motionless on the ground. The patrol car rolled closer, its officers stepping out cautiously. The officer's flashlight beam landed on Rachel and Emily. "Dispatch, I've got two down," he said into his radio, requesting immediate medical assistance. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. Rachel lay pale and still, a gash on her head bleeding profusely. Emily, though breathing, showed signs of a concussion. and minor bruising. They're both unconscious but stable. One of the medics reported, "We need to move them now." As they lifted Rachel onto the stretcher, her jacket shifted slightly, and the USB drive remained securely hidden in her pocket. The attackers had missed it, leaving behind the very evidence they sought to destroy. The news of the attack reached Judge Kane early the next morning. He sat at his desk sipping coffee as his assistant handed him a newspaper. The headline read, "Woman and Child Assaulted in Brutal Attack." Kane skimmed the article, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Miller and the girl both hospitalized," his assistant summarized. "It says she's in critical condition." Critical condition. Kane repeated, his tone cold and detached. "They're done. Make sure the narrative stays vague. No loose ends." He dismissed his assistant and leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. In his mind, the problem was resolved. Unbeknownst to him, the USB drive was still safely tucked in Rachel's pocket, waiting to resurface when it was needed most. The sterile scent of the hospital filled Emily's nose as she stirred awake, her head pounding from the attack. Her small hands gripped the sides of the bed as she forced herself to sit up, her vision swinning for a moment before the room came into focus. The faint beeping of monitors reminded her of where she was. Turning her head, Emily's gaze landed on Rachel lying motionless in the bed next to her. Bandages wrapped around Rachel's head, and her normally animated face was pale and slack. "Rachel," Emily whispered, her voice raspy. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet brushing the cool floor. As she stood shakily, she shuffled closer to Rachel's bed, placing a hand gently on her arm. "Rachel, wake up. We have to help my dad." But Rachel didn't stir. Emily's heart sank as panic bubbled in her chest. She remembered the attack, the men who had come for Rachel's bag, and how Rachel had hidden the USB drive in her jacket pocket. Before they left the office, Emily's eyes widened as realization hit her. The evidence, her mind raced. Without the evidence, her dad's trial that morning would be hopeless. She turned toward the door just as a nurse entered, her expression softening when she saw Emily awake. "Hey there, sweetheart," the nurse said gently, walking over to check Emily's vitals. How are you feeling?" Emily shook her head, ignoring the question. "I need Rachel's jacket," she said urgently, her voice trembling but firm. "She has something important in her pocket. It's for my dad." The nurse frowned slightly. "Honey, you need to rest. You've been through a lot." "No," Emily insisted, her voice rising. "You don't understand. It's evidence. It can save my dad. Please." Tears welled in her eyes as she gripped the nurse's arm. "If I don't get it to court, they'll think he's guilty." "But he's not." The nurse hesitated, her brow furrowing. Emily's desperation was palpable, her trembling hands and pleading eyes cutting through any doubt. "Okay," the nurse finally said, exhaling. "Wait here. I'll see what I can do." Emily watched as the nurse left the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. When the nurse returned, she held Rachel's jacket in her hands. Emily's relief was immediate as she snatched at her fingers, fumbling through the pockets until she found the small USB drive. "This is it," Emily whispered, clutching it tightly. The nurse knelt beside her, concern etched on her face. "Emily, what are you planning to do with that?" Emily's grip on the drive tightened. "I need to get it to court. It's the only way to prove my dad didn't do it." The nurse sighed, glancing toward Rachel's still form. "But how are you going to get there?" Emily bit her lip, her mind racing. "Can you take me?" "I can't leave my shift," the nurse said gently. "But I know someone who can." She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Within minutes, a retired police officer named Joe, a friend of the nurse, arrived at the hospital. His kind eyes scanned Emily, and he nodded. "You must be the brave girl I heard about," he said. "I'll get you to the courthouse." Emily followed him out. The USB drive clutched tightly in her hand, she sat silently in the passenger seat of Joe's old sedan, her eyes fixed on the horizon. As the courthouse came into view, Joe glanced at her, sensing her nerves. "You're doing a brave thing, kid. Your dad would be proud." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I have to do this," she said quietly, "for him." The courthouse loomed ahead, its imposing facade filling Emily with a mix of fear and determination. Joe parked the car and opened the door for her. "Go on, kid, you've got this." Emily bolted up the steps, her small frame weaving through the crowd gathered for the high-profile trial. She clutched the USB drive tightly, her heart racing. As she pushed open the heavy doors, inside the trial was already underway. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating as Jack Carter sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped and his eyes heavy with defeat. Across the room, The prosecution's lead attorney delivered a scathing closing argument, painting Jack as a desperate man driven to murder. The jury's expressions were grim, their minds seemingly made up. Judge Kane watched with an air of authority, his gavel resting within reach. To anyone observing the trial, seemed like a foregone conclusion. This man, the prosecutor declared, pointing at Jack, had every motive and opportunity to kill Richard Hale. The evidence against him is overwhelming. There is no doubt in my mind that Jack Carter is guilty. Jack's public defender visibly strained, rose to make one final plea. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my client has maintained his innocence from the beginning. There is more to this case than meets the eye. Suddenly, the heavy courtroom doors burst open, the sound echoing off the walls like a gunshot gasp rippled through the audience as everyone turned to see a small figure standing in the doorway. It was Emily. The 7-year-old stepped into the room, her face pale but resolute. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her hands trembled as she clutched Rachel's USB. She walked forward, her eyes locked on Judge Kane, who froze in his seat. His expression flickered for a brief moment, shock, then fear, quickly masked by a neutral facade. Emily's voice rang out high and clear. He did it. The room fell into stunned silence. Whispers broke out among the spectators, and even the prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, staring at the little girl in disbelief. Jack's eyes widened as he sat upright, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. Judge Kane's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. Young lady, he began, his voice strained, this is a court of law. You cannot. Emily cut him off, her small voice carrying the weight of her determination. He did it. Judge Kane killed Richard Hale. Rachel found proof. She held up Rachel's phone, her tiny hand trembling as she waved it toward Jack's attorney. The defense attorney, stunned but quick to act, walked over and knelt to Emily's level. This, Emily said, handing him the USB. Rachel found it. It's a recording, she said. It would prove my dad didn't do it. The attorney took the USB and connected it to his laptop. Your Honor, he said, glancing at Kane with suspicion, I ask for permission to play this recording. It's critical evidence. Judge Kane's face tightened. I don't see how this is relevant. It is. The attorney interrupted, firmly, emboldened by the shift in the room. The jury deserves to hear this. Kane hesitated, his eyes darting toward the exits, as though calculating his chances of escape. But under the watchful eyes of the jury and the crowd, he had no choice but to nod. The courtroom held its breath as the recording began to play. The sound was faint, at first static,